So in this unit, Unit 11, we're looking at a different example, and I called it the state of the environmental union. I thought that a lot of my students would be quite interested to look at how environmental policies have been dealt with, both in the EU and Canada, knowing that in some cases, and very often in the media, environmental policy is, to speak modestly about it, a difficult case, but also fairly recent in the history of those, in the history of the EU or in the history of the countries of Canada itself. There were no European environmental policies in the 1960s and 70s, or very, very small ones, and the same in Canada. These are policies that are fairly modern and have become very influential fairly recently. It is also interesting to see what level of government is responsible for these policies, whether in Canada it's the federal level, whether in the EU it is the EU level, the union level, that basically sets the standards but also organizes the implementation of the policy, becomes obviously extremely important. Who sets the standards? What level of government sets the standards? And how are the standards then implemented across both systems? So one of the things that won't surprise you, I think, is that in Canada, the environmental union and defining or reaching a consensus on climate change has been very controversial and quite polarizing. And it is clearly identified by a lot of surveys of people's opinion that there is or not any form of climate change. And that it is itself a fairly complex policy issue or policy arena because it is controversial. It is also been fairly, I would say, challenging policy arena because it is shared between the federal and provincial levels. So the provinces have responsibility for instance, for natural resources, but Ottawa has the legal authority and the jurisdiction over trade, commerce, fisheries, and then a number of other policies such as criminal law and peace and order and good government. And so in Canada, the idea of environmental issues has always been a bit of a challenge and a bit of a reason to see and to study tensions within the intergovernmental systems in the country, which is very interesting, obviously. In the EU, where there is today a European Union Directorate for the environment, there is a very strong leadership in favor of developing not only standards across the member states or standards across the EU, but even developing sets of standards that would impose and pose obligations to the rest of the world. And it is illustrated, for instance, by the role of the European Union in the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, where you see not only specific member states like the state of France that has taken a leadership position with regard to the Paris Agreement and to host the Paris Agreement discussions as well, but has gone as far as discussing, and I'm talking about the Union itself, discussing standards that would be basically discussed and then imposed to the rest of the world. So it is very interesting to compare both systems because it seems, at least on the surface, that in the European Union, most member states have found ways to bring together substantial agreement behind state and union level policies and even standards that would superimpose those existing across the world, whereas in Canada it remains an ongoing discussion between the federal and provincial governments and is a challenging policy topic that illustrates for us really well the difficulty of intergovernmental relations. Here again you have videos that illustrate the different debates and the different positions. You also have required readings that again illustrate the different positions and how different stakeholders view themselves in this regard. And you can compare therefore the two forms of intergovernmental relations, that of Canada and that of the EU, through the readings and in the questions set for discussion this week. And I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much.